Welcome back. You're watching Your World at 10 now. It was the second day of hearings for the Ambani gas dispute in the Supreme Court. Here's a quick recap of the day's highlights. The government's stance was that if it does not want to interfere in a private matter, that it only wants to protect government policy. When asked by the bench, Reliance Industries responded that if it were to sell gas to RNRL at $2.34 per MMBTU, it would incur an approximately 30% loss. Besides, it needs government approval to do so, that being the moot point. But the most interesting development in court today, according to me at least, was the bench's line of questioning, and I'm quoting some of that. If suitable agreement is not reached, does the demerger fail? If suitable agreement is fundamental to demerger, then what is the solution? Is it arbitration or mediation or third party or by another court? Is it the company's court? Now, the question I'd like to ask on this discussion is, does this indicate the Supreme Court will also take into consideration the commercial inviolability of a failed family MOU? That is, the commercial consequences if that family MOU is failed. Joining me to discuss this and other aspects of this very interesting case are Supreme Court Advocate Gopal Jain and lawyer Hitesh Jain of ALMT. Well, Gopal, why don't you go first? What do you make of some of the questions that the Supreme Court asked, or the bench asked in court today? I would admit right up front that, of course, this is not the full proceedings of the day in court. It's just a few of the highlights.
Well, I think, as you started by saying, usually the court decides the matter, that, namely the issue which arises from a high court judgment. But quite clearly in this case, there are implications of government policy, of foreign investment, and a whole host of issues which have come up. And the court, as a custodian of public interest, obviously will balance commercial interests and rights with public interest, the implications of government policy, the sanctity of EGM decisions. So I think, broadly said, I think the issues are going to be broader than just the fight between the two brothers.
Hitesh, would you agree with that? Do you think that the Supreme Court bench will restrict itself to just delivering a judgment on the Bombay High Court judgment, or will it look into other matters that pertain to this case, including the fact that there is a family MOU and its viability in question? Should that be superseding, or should that be binding on two corporate entities? And then what happens to government public policy when it comes to natural resources?
According to me, this case, all possibilities cannot be ruled out. It will all depend upon ultimate conclusion the Supreme Court wants to reach. I mean, if it wants to go in the favor of RIL-RNRL, it may just restrict itself to the High Court decision and say that the view taken by the High Court is legally correct and there is nothing required to be interfered, because a special leave petition, it is a discretionary jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court may decline to interfere anything further. But if suppose the Supreme Court is of the view that the agreement executed between the brother is not binding on the company, and these are the larger issue that needs to be considered, the Supreme Court can go well beyond the High Court judgment and can look into every possible issue. So according to me, till the arguments are not concluded one way or the other, I will not rule out any possibility.
Thank you, Hitesh. Well spoken as a lawyer. You ruled everything in. Gopal, what does precedent tell us of how the Supreme Court, I know there is no precedent to a case like this, but how the Supreme Court views issues like this, which at the very heart are of commercial contract, but then can be expanded to look into aspects of governance and public policy?
Yes, so as you rightly said, there are different components or parts to this case. One is the aspect of commercial rights between two parties. The other is the public interest component, which is government policy and its implications. So I think, as Hitesh rightly said, 136 is a very wide jurisdiction the Supreme Court has, and the endeavor always of the court is to do substantial justice and take a holistic view. And that would mean taking all these aspects into account.
You're a strong voter.
And now that the government itself...
Go ahead, Gopal. Finish that.
And now that the government itself has filed a petition and is before the court, obviously the scope of the proceedings is enlarged by virtue of the SLP itself filed by the government.
All right,
and that will have to be considered by the court alongside the, the challenge by RIL and RNRL.
All right, if you can hear me clearly, because I can see you fiddling with your earpiece. You're a strong votary of public interest in this case, Gopal. What do you think will weigh in terms of importance more on that Supreme Court bench? Will it be the underlying commercial contract? Will it be the fact that this is also the case of a family decision or a family distribution of wealth, being made binding on corporate entities? I mean, very interestingly, I want to bring up that in the first week of October, 6 or 5 directors of Reliance Industries actually filed an affidavit in court saying that they had no clue of the family MOU and that it cannot be binding upon the board of a corporate entity. it's come many years late, but it's a great governance position to take, and it's exactly what we've been debating all these years. How can a family agreement weigh upon two corporate entities? Or is the Supreme Court going to take an even higher ground and say, well, the thing of primary importance here is public policy when it comes to natural resources. We are a fuel-starved nation, and that will weigh most important.
Yes, I think from what you say, I agree with that view that the overriding importance which the court will attach will be to that aspect, which is the policy, who's the owner of the resource, how the resource is to be used, the implications it will have on the power sector, the fertilizer sector, and the ordinary citizen. That is certainly a very, very important component, and that is precisely what I think the government is going to raise. And today's question, from what you say, which was put on the profitability of RIL, obviously it shows the thinking in the court's mind. Can they find a balance? Namely, can they ensure adequate availability of gas to all users, and at the same time, can they protect commercial profitability? So I think it's a balanced and cautious approach, though it's early days, but that's the trend, if I may use that word.
All right. Hitesh, come in on this. The Supreme Court, in the many questions that it asked today, also asked the question, if suitable agreement is not reached, does the demerger fail? Is this agreement fundamental to demerger? And if that is the case, what is the solution? Clearly, they seem to also be concerned about the commercial implications of a family MOU, becoming unviable. And then what happens? How important is that going to be? Or what kind of role is that going to play in this entire court case? Because at the end of it, this is a fight between two promoters.
According to me, this is one of the key factors which is going to be the decisive factor in the entire dispute. The decisive question that needs to be answered is the MOU binding on the company? Now, there has been a judgment of the Supreme Court in the past in the Rangaraj's case where it has said that the private arrangement arrived between the shareholders is not binding upon the company unless the company is a party to such an agreement or the arrangement. So therefore, the argument that has been advanced as this is an independent MOU arrangement arrived between
Hitesh, that's fine. The question I was asking you, I'm not even asking you that. I'm saying the Supreme Court also seems to be concerned about the fact that whatever judgment they deliver, if that negates the family MOU, what are the commercial consequences of that? Would you read it as that?
Well, one will have to look at this as one of the pointers of the Supreme Court, because see, ultimately what happens is this is going to be a long hearing, and as the hearing will unfold and as the submission, since this is the one what has been happening is today the one side has been arguing, and therefore the Supreme Court is accordingly posing the questions. So this may be one of the factors that may be weighing on the minds of the Supreme Court judges.
Okay, last point to you, Gopal. On the face of it, this family MOU goes against public gas policy, right? Because two promoters have distributed what is essentially a natural resource, which the government is now objecting to. How is the Supreme Court going to balance both requirements to meet public policy requirements as well as to ensure that the commercial viability of this MOU is upheld so that that doesn't cause chaos? Because let's not forget, 4 demergers were effected on the basis of this MOU.
Yes, that is the billion-dollar question, and I think we should wait for the Supreme Court to decide, which is precisely why all of us have faith in that, and judges do decide difficult matters. But I think that aside, usually the courts are always able to find as I said, a balanced and cautious approach, which is don't jeopardize policy. If there's a conflict between the private understanding, which is the MOU, and government policy, then possibly one view is always that the government policy will prevail. And the questions which the court is putting, though it's early days, indicates that they may find a way of balancing the commercial interest. But I think, as I said earlier, by and large, the Supreme Court always takes a much larger view of the matter, because it's a signal not just to people in India, but to foreign investors, the growth of the sector, the investment climate, the aspects of, sanctity of government policy. So there are a whole host of issues, I think, which have to be decided. And I think we should track the case as it goes on to see in which direction it's going.
Well, absolutely. We will be doing that. We'll have both you gentlemen back with us on regular occasions to be able to track this case. Gopal, Hitesh, thank you very much for joining us on Your World at 10.